In the center of Berlin, a few meters from the Spree River, there's a place that almost no one mentions. From the outside, it looks like just a park with trees. But behind the gates and among the undergrowth lies one of Germany's most inconvenient cemeteries, the Invalidenfriedhof. High-ranking members of the Nazi regime were buried there. Generals, police chiefs, key officials of the Third Reich. Some still remain underground. Others were exhumed, some without warning, others in secret. The place was closed for decades, sealed, erased from maps. Not out of forgetfulness, but out of fear. Because those graves became meeting points for extremist groups. Some were vandalized, others under surveillance, some were simply erased, but they never completely disappeared. Hidden exhumations, illegal tributes, anonymous gravestones, and bodies moved without permission. Each grave, a conflict. Each name, a risk. What seemed buried continues to inspire fear. The Invisible Cemetery. What is the Invalidenfriedhof and why was it hidden? In the middle of Berlin, very close to the Spree River, lies a site that is almost never mentioned. From the outside, it looks like nothing more than a garden with scattered trees. But behind the fence, amid branches and disordered graves, lies one of Germany's most difficult burial grounds to digest, the Invalidenfriedhof. For a long time, this place housed high-ranking officials of Hitler's regime, generals, police officers, and key figures of the Third Reich. Some are still buried there. Others were removed. Some without anyone knowing. Others were planned, but quietly. The site was closed for many years. They covered it up. They left it out of the plans. It wasn't because they forgot, it was because they were considered a danger. These graves began to attract Nazi sympathizers. Some were destroyed. Others were kept under guard. Several were simply removed. But they never completely disappeared. The graves, the names, and the remains continued to be a source of vigilance. Among the trees and damaged walls, traces of a once important place can still be seen. The Invalidenfriedhof was built centuries earlier, during the Prussian era. Army officers were buried there. It was a site steeped in military history, used for generations. But over time, and especially with the arrival of the Third Reich, it became a cemetery for Nazi leaders. Not all those buried there were known, but they were part of the machinery that propelled the dictatorship. When the war ended, the site was left in no man's land. In the first years of Soviet occupation, soldiers from the east set up checkpoints in the area. The cemetery was cut off by the Berlin Wall. Part was inaccessible, part was destroyed. Plaques were placed over it. Some graves were covered with concrete. No one could enter without permission. In the eyes of the government, it no longer existed. But although it was not physically visible, the place never lost its significance. In official archives, it was marked. The secret police from the east kept an eye on it. They knew Nazi figures lay buried there, and they feared it could become a gathering point. Starting in the 1950s, reports began to circulate of flowers left on nameless gravestones, of nighttime visits, of vigils on anniversaries. The reports noted license plates, names of people entering and leaving. Everything was written down. During the 1970s, the authorities decided to cover up the cemetery even more. They covered names, they removed plaques. Some gravestones were acid-etched, others were turned upside down. The goal was to erase its identity, to make it impossible to know who was buried there, to make it impossible for anyone to pay tribute. In the eyes of the city, it was just an enclosed garden. In the 1980s, the Berlin Wall ran along the edge of the cemetery. A section remained under direct surveillance. Armed soldiers patrolled, motion sensors were installed, the grounds became part of the defense system, access was prohibited, only authorized personnel entered. Not to guard graves, but to control the perimeter. With the fall of the wall in 1989, the area became available again. Some citizens entered for the first time. They found broken gravestones, sunken graves, and areas overgrown with weeds. No one knew quite who was there. Some names were illegible, others were covered over, but in certain corners the symbols were clear. There were remains of fresh flowers, candles, new inscriptions made with a knife or paint. Then a public discussion began. What to do with the Invalidenfriedhof? Demolish it, preserve it, turn it into a museum? The authorities hesitated. They didn't want it to become a shrine, but they couldn't hide it forever either. Some historians called for keeping it open, displaying it as a testament to the past. Others demanded its complete closure. They argued that every gravestone was a danger. Finally, the site was partially restored, not to honor those buried, but for documentation. Part of the ground was cleared. Information plaques were installed, but not with praise, but with dates, positions, and historical context. Some graves were removed, others were preserved without names. A few were left as they were, but under surveillance. The site remained open to the public, but without any promotion. Today, anyone walking through the Invalidenfriedhof sees gravestones without inscriptions, holes in the ground, metal plaques with neutral words. Everything seems peaceful, but beneath, tension persists. Every grave can spark controversy. Every name can provoke discussion. The cemetery is not a monument. It's a field steeped in history, of silences, of political decisions. Several of the bodies were moved in secret. There is no clear record. Some believe they were moved to mass graves. Others say they were exhumed and then disappeared. The archives don't confirm this. But the truth is that many graves are empty. Others remain complete but are not marked. Some families asked for privacy. They didn't want their family name exposed or their grave vandalized. The most famous case is that of Reinhard Heydrich, whose grave was located but not marked. His headstone was removed. His name was covered up. No one could determine the exact location. But even so, some found it. And they left symbols. On one occasion, in the early hours of the morning, someone left flowers and a message. They didn't mention their name, just one word: present. Faced with this, the police installed hidden cameras. They began recording movements, taking note of who entered and on what dates. June 2nd, the day of his death, was key. Every year, surveillance was reinforced. Backpacks were checked, special patrols were made. But they didn't always manage to prevent the tributes. This was just one case. But it was repeated with other names. Joseph Goebbels, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Stuckert all had graves that generated tension. Some were exhumed, others were erased. Still others were left as they were, but with warnings. The plaques were replaced with generic signs. They didn't say "here lies," just a number, a date, nothing more. The Invalidenfriedhof isn't the only cemetery with this type of burial, but it is the most symbolic because of its location, because of its history, and for what it represents. It's a place where the past never rests, where each tombstone is an archive, and where memory cannot be completely erased, not with concrete, not with silence. Over time, some graves at the Invalidenfriedhof were identified by frequent visitors, not by visible signs, but by cross-referencing them with old maps, confidential reports, and unofficial publications. Groups of curious onlookers, researchers, or sympathizers plotted routes within the cemetery. They identified sectors, they measured distances, they compared aerial photos with previous records. That's how they knew where a particular grave had been, even if no trace remained. At certain times, radical groups attempted symbolic acts. They left flowers with black ribbons. They wrote names on stones. In one case, a makeshift cross made of branches was reportedly placed right on the site of the body of a high-ranking SS officer. The police removed it a few hours later. From then on, the spot remained under discreet surveillance. The authorities knew they couldn't prevent people from approaching. The cemetery was open. What they did do was control the information. In official guides, the site isn't highlighted. On tourist maps, there are no icons. At the entrance, a mere neutral plaque explains its history as a military site. It doesn't mention a single name linked to Nazism. For decades, the neighborhood residents tried to stay on the fence. They knew what was there, but preferred not to talk. Some said they heard footsteps at night. Others said they saw lights. Occasionally, groups dressed in black would stop in front of specific areas. They didn't make a sound, they just watched. Sometimes they took photos, then they left. They never left a trace. The most compromised graves were modified. Some were completely flattened. Others were surrounded by artificial vegetation so they wouldn't be noticeable from the outside. In several cases, benches were installed right on top, so anyone arriving at the site wouldn't see a grave but a space to sit. Beneath the wood, the coffin remained. During a restoration carried out in the 1990s, the foreman found fragmented skeletal remains in unrecorded areas. There were bones mixed with disturbed earth. They didn't know if they belonged to old graves or if they were the result of undocumented transfers. In one case, military buttons bearing the Reich eagle were found. They were stored in boxes. They were never displayed. The Ministry of the Interior then ordered a review of the funeral archives. They wanted to know exactly who was still buried there. The task was complicated. Some records were in poor condition. Others had been lost during the war. There were cards with names but no coordinates, dates with no location, codes with no explanation. The reconstruction took months. At the end of the report, it was confirmed that at least 30 important figures of the Nazi regime were still buried there. Some graves were empty, others were incomplete. In some cases, only minimal remains remained. It was not clear who had disturbed them. Speculation arose from relatives, opponents, or even authorities who acted without leaving a trace. An internal order restricted access to certain areas. Technically, the cemetery remained public, but some paths were chained off. Notices in German were posted reading "Area under maintenance." This was a way of keeping curious onlookers away without directly prohibiting them from entering. A balance was maintained, neither hidden nor promoted. The media avoided touching on the subject for a long time. Only a few specialized magazines mentioned the cemetery. They did so cautiously. They spoke of controversial graves, of a sensitive site. They didn't name the dead. They didn't show images. The mainstream press ignored it completely. It was as if the place didn't exist. At the same time, foreign publications emerged revealing new information. A British investigation included an aerial photo taken in 1945, which clearly showed the original layout of the cemetery. It included names and dates. When compared with the current view, it was clear which graves had disappeared and which remained. This revived international interest. In response, the German government issued a brief statement. It stated that the Invalidenfriedhof was a historic site under supervision and that current legislation was respected. No names were given, no talk of exhumations, nor was it made clear which graves were empty or which had been erased. The generic language was maintained. Meanwhile, the place continued to change. The grass grew. The plaques rusted. Some graves, despite the passage of time, remained intact. It was difficult to explain why. In theory, all those related to war criminals were supposed to be depersonalized, but there were exceptions. In one corner, a tombstone with an iron cross and dates matching a general executed at Nuremberg was still visible. Human rights organizations called for transparency. They wanted information on who was buried, under what conditions, and why. They argued that concealment only generated rumors, that if it was hidden, something was wrong. The authorities rejected that version. They said the discretion was to avoid dangerous tributes. In one of the most controversial cases, a grave was completely vandalized. The marble was smashed with sledgehammers, the cross was removed, the remains were left exposed. An investigation was launched. No one was found responsible. Since then, it was decided to cover the area with earth and plant bushes on top. Today, no one would know there had ever been a grave there. The Invalidenfriedhof remained like this, like a half-field, neither completely public nor completely secret, neither open nor sealed. Some gravestones remain, others do not. Some graves have names, others just grass. The visitor would not know what they were seeing. Only by investigating, by comparing, by asking questions can they begin to understand. But even then, the information is partial. The answers arrive in fragments. No one confirms everything. No one completely denies anything. The cemetery in the end functions as a mirror of German memory. There is no complete official version, only fragments, remains, and decisions made in silence without warning and without visible record. Heydrich Underground, the unmarked grave of the architect of terror. Reinhard Heydrich died in Prague in June 1942 after an attack by British-trained Czech commandos. His funeral was held in Berlin with full regime honors. At that time, he was buried with an official ceremony in the Invalidenfriedhof cemetery alongside other senior military commanders. The location of his grave was unclear for a time. There was a marble tombstone. It bore his name, his rank, and the date of his death. But that didn't last long. With the German defeat in 1945, the site came under Soviet control. In the following years, Heydrich's grave became an awkward spot. He wasn't just another soldier, he was one of the organizers of the final solution. His name carried too much weight. They couldn't leave it visible. In the late 1940s, the tombstone was removed. No one said why. It wasn't made public, it just disappeared. From then on, the site where Heydrich's remains lay remained an unmarked area. There was no cross, no inscription, just grass. The grave was there, but unmarked. For decades, no one mentioned its exact location, neither the Eastern government nor the Western government. Official archives said nothing. However, researchers from different countries began searching. They compared old photographs, witness accounts, and previous maps. They managed to locate the exact spot where he was buried, not through records but by calculation. The northern sector of the cemetery, third row, next to the wall. That was the place. At first glance, it was just a rectangle of earth, but those who knew recognized it. On several occasions, that space was disturbed. Unidentified flowers appeared, sometimes small candles. Once, a handwritten, unsigned note read, "We do not forget." The police quietly removed everything. No announcements were made, no information was given. It was routine, a silent protocol. During the 1970s, the Eastern authorities placed specific surveillance in that area. They knew what that grave meant. They didn't want it to become an altar. On one anniversary, they found a small metal cross stuck in the ground. They removed it. They did a more in-depth inspection. They detected fresh footprints. Since then, that spot has been under constant monitoring. After German reunification in 1990, there was a new survey of graves at the Invalidenfriedhof. Plans were reviewed, dates were compared. Heydrich's grave was still there. It hadn't been disturbed. The remains hadn't been moved. But the authorities decided not to reinstall the tombstone. The site remained as it was, smooth earth, unmarked. In 2000, a group of journalists investigated the situation. They visited the cemetery. They took photographs. They conducted interviews. They confirmed what many suspected, that the grave was intact, just unmarked. They published an article. It said that Reinhard Heydrich was still buried in Berlin, but that his grave was invisible. There was no official response. In the following years, new incidents occurred. In 2012, a person was arrested for placing a red rose on the exact spot where the remains lay. He had no identification. He didn't explain anything. He was released hours later. The incident was recorded. Surveillance was reinforced. But the flow of discreet visits didn't stop. One of the government's decisions was to leave the grounds without any special maintenance. Thus, the grass grew just like the rest of the cemetery. There were no visible differences, but those who knew the facts knew what was there. Police reports continued to pile up, none with names, only physical descriptions and dates. In 2014, the cemetery underwent a general restoration. Weeds were cut, paths were cleared, walls were repaired. In that process, Heydrich's grave was respected. It wasn't touched. No earth was disturbed, but nothing new was installed either. It remained the same, flat, covered with grass. The Historic Sites Oversight Committee debated whether to place a plaque with informative information, not as a tribute, but as a context. The proposal was rejected. They argued that any sign could be used by extremist groups. They preferred anonymity, visual oblivion, although everyone knew it was impossible to erase completely. In 2016, an updated map of the cemetery was leaked. It listed Heydrich's grave with an alphanumeric code. It didn't mention his name, but cross-referencing confirmed its location. That file circulated among researchers. It was cited in academic publications. Since then, it has been assumed to be confirmed. However, in 2019, an unexpected event occurred. An unknown group desecrated the grave. At dawn, someone moved earth. The surface was broken. They were unable to fully open the pit, but the intent was clear. The police arrived at dawn. They sealed the area. They issued no statements. The Ministry of the Interior later confirmed that there had been vandalism. They said the remains had not been disturbed, that the grave would remain sealed, that surveillance would be strengthened. Since then, night vision cameras and motion sensors have been installed, all silent, no visible plaques, no advertisements. Reinhard Heydrich remains buried in Berlin, underground, without a name, without a cross, but under constant surveillance. His grave is one of the most protected in Germany, not out of respect, but out of fear that it might become a symbol, because even today his figure divides, and his memory continues to generate conflict. After the attempted desecration in 2019, authorities decided to take further measures at the cemetery. One of them was to hide direct access to Heydrich's grave. Park benches were moved to that area, placing them right on the ground. From then on, anyone who sat in that spot did so unaware that the remains of the head of the Reich Main Security Office lay beneath. The surveillance system was updated. Thermal cameras were added. Ground sensors alerted anyone walking along that specific area at night. The patrol wasn't in uniform. They wore civilian clothes. They walked naturally, but they knew exactly where to watch. They didn't speak to visitors. They just observed. If they saw anything out of the ordinary, they reported it immediately. During World War II commemorations, that part of the cemetery was temporarily fenced off. Signs were posted saying, "Area closed for maintenance." No one was allowed to approach. Workers passing by were ordered not to linger. They were to cut the grass without looking. They were to avoid any prolonged contact with the site. The case files remain sealed. Decisions about Heydrich's grave are made internally. No minutes are published. No announcements are made. Any modification is recorded as a generic gardening task. This way, no trace is left behind. The caretakers rotate. They are not always the same. This way, no one accumulates too much information. A German researcher managed to interview a former official from the Heritage Department. He confirmed that the government knows exactly where the grave is. He confirmed that they have no intention of removing it. He said that moving those remains could generate a public discussion that they don't want to open. They prefer it to remain as it is, silent, buried, nameless. Heydrich's descendants have not made public complaints. They are known to live outside the country. They have never requested the transfer of remains, nor have they requested any signage. Their silence has been interpreted as part of the implicit agreement. Don't move, don't point out, don't honor, leave everything on hold, as if it didn't exist. In the immediate vicinity of the grave, some new tombstones were installed with common names. They aren't original graves. They were placed there to divert attention. To anyone looking at the cemetery map, it will look like a normal area, but beneath those generic names there are no bodies. They are just stones placed to cover awkward gaps. One of the internal reports notes that this technique has worked. It deters the curious, it confuses extremists, and it allows the place to function as just another cemetery without attracting fanatics. The key has been neither to deny nor to confirm, just to leave everything as if it didn't matter. But every now and then something happens. In 2021, an independent journalist placed a hidden camera in the area. He recorded a man standing right over the grave. He took a photo, he looked around, and he left. He left nothing. He didn't say anything. The video was posted. In less than a day, it was deleted from all platforms. No one claimed the rights. It just disappeared. That same year, a history student wanted to write a paper on the unmarked graves of the Nazis. He requested permission to interview the cemetery's caretakers. His request was rejected without explanation. They advised him to change the subject, to choose another location, another figure, and to steer clear of the Heydrich case. The Invalidenfriedhof cemetery is still open to the public. Anyone can enter, but no one can speak clearly about that exact spot. The guidebooks don't mention it, the brochures omit it, and the workers, if asked directly, say they don't know, that there's no record, that they just cut the grass. The stones surrounding the area are worn. Some have cracks, others have been moved slightly. Everything looks ancient, natural, but that appearance has been carefully constructed. Nothing is there by accident. Every bench, every tree, every bush was placed to deflect attention, to maintain the secret without completely sealing it off. There are no other graves like it in Germany. Other war criminals were exhumed, moved, or cremated, but Heydrich remained there, not as a tribute. But because moving him was more problematic than leaving him, because if they removed him, someone would notice, and if they marked him, others would go to see him. So they left him buried and nameless. Some experts on historical memory say that this decision was political, that Germany preferred to hide certain remains rather than confront them. That silence was more useful than the truth. But those voices have no space in official media. They are not interviewed, they are not quoted. They only circulate in small books and discreet conferences. Today, more than 80 years after his death, Heydrich remains in Berlin. A few steps from the River Spree, underground, under benches, under grass, without a cross, without a plaque, but not forgotten because there are those who continue searching for him. Those who know where he is, and those who, from time to time, approach in silence. They show respect or repudiation, but never indifference. The state, for its part, maintains surveillance, not to pay tribute, but to prevent others from doing so. Because a grave like this, even if it doesn't have a name, can become a symbol. And that, in Germany, is something they don't want to see again. Uncomfortable bodies, the remains of Goebbels, Frank, Rosenberg, and other Nazis. In the final days of April 1945, when the defeat of the Third Reich was evident, Joseph Goebbels and his wife Magda made a radical decision. They would not allow their children to live in a world without Nazism. They gave them poison, one by one. Then they went down to the Chancellery Garden and committed suicide. Goebbels' body was burned, but he was not completely reduced. Remains remained, bone fragments, pieces of skull. Everything was collected by the Soviets. Those fragments were taken to a special facility in East Berlin. There was no public record. They were classified under code. Over the years, Goebbels' remains were stored alongside other bodies from Hitler's inner circle. No one knew exactly where. The same thing happened with Martin Bormann. Although for decades it was believed he had escaped, his bones appeared in 1972 during construction work near Lehrte station. DNA analysis confirmed they were his. He had been dead since 1945. He was buried in secret. Hans Frank, one of the main perpetrators of the extermination in Poland, was hanged after the Nuremberg trials in 1946. His body, like that of the other condemned men, was cremated. The ashes were thrown into a river. There was no grave. There was no headstone. The decision was intentional, to prevent their graves from becoming places of worship for sympathizers. The same happened with Alfred Rosenberg. His execution was immediate after the sentencing. His body was also cremated. The Allied authorities knew the symbolic power a grave could have. That's why they left no visible remains. Relatives didn't receive ashes. They couldn't organize burials. There were no farewells, only sealed files. However, not all cases were the same. Wilhelm Keitel, head of the High Command, was also executed. His remains were treated with the same protocol, but some sources suggest that a small bone fragment was kept by one of the forensic doctors. This has not been confirmed. The matter remains a rumor. It was never officially verified. Heinrich Himmler, on the other hand, was captured by British troops in May 1945. He was carrying false documentation. When discovered, he swallowed a cyanide capsule. He died within minutes. His body was buried in an undisclosed location outside Lüneburg. There is no headstone. The exact record was destroyed. Only a small group of officers knew where it was placed. The British authorities decided to keep it secret. They didn't want Himmler to have a grave. They knew he could become a symbol for radical groups. So they chose a random location, dug it up quickly, and covered it up. No one witnessed it. There are no documents available. Information circulates only by word of mouth among former military personnel. Other Nazi leaders, such as Julius Streicher and Ernst Kaltenbrunner, were also executed. Their bodies followed the same protocol: cremation, ashes removed, no burial. But in some cases, deviations are suspected. Reports indicate that Kaltenbrunner's dental remains were stored for medical reasons. This has not been publicly verified. For decades, historians have tried to reconstruct the fate of these bodies. They have reviewed military archives, medical reports, and soldiers' testimonies. Much information remains classified. Some countries, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, still restrict information about the handling of Nazi remains. They say that disclosing it could encourage pilgrimages or revive ideologies. In Germany, the debate over what to do with existing graves remains ongoing. For example, the grave of Albert Speer, architect of the regime and minister of armaments, is still visited. It is located in Heidelberg. It was not disturbed. Sometimes it receives flowers. No one knows who left them. But they appear every year on the same day. Speer was convicted in Nuremberg but not executed. He served 20 years in prison and died in freedom. That's why his grave wasn't hidden. It's in a public cemetery, unguarded. But there are cameras. The city council discreetly monitors visits. If they detect organized meetings, they intervene. Other cases, such as that of Karl Dönitz, Hitler's nominal successor after his death, also generate controversy. Dönitz died in 1980. He is buried with his family in northern Germany. His grave is modest, but some visitors leave symbolic objects. The local government has tried to minimize the site, but it cannot legally eliminate it. Over the years, graves of regime members hidden under false names have been discovered. Families changed surnames. They modified inscriptions. They avoided mentions of the past. But in some cases, researchers have managed to identify the true identities. When things are made public, flowers or graffiti often appear. One of the most problematic places was the Munich cemetery. The remains of high-ranking SS officers were buried there. The police noticed that on certain anniversaries, small groups came to leave candles or insignia. They made no noise. They only placed symbols. The city council decided to intervene. They covered several gravestones. They didn't remove them. They just covered them with earth and vegetation. On other occasions, excavation was necessary. During highway expansion works or housing construction, remains of soldiers identified as party members have appeared, some with medals, others with hidden documents. Laws require reporting, but this isn't always followed. Some cases are resolved quietly. As the years pass, the number of identified graves decreases. Many cemeteries were reorganized, others were abandoned. But intelligence services continue to update databases on possible memorial centers. They have maps, lists, and photographs, not for dissemination, only for monitoring. Germany maintains a clear policy, not to allow the glorification of Nazism. This includes avoiding any type of burial that could be used as a symbol. Therefore, when a name appears in a cemetery, its history is reviewed. If a link to crimes is confirmed, action is taken, not always with excavation, sometimes just with surveillance. In many cases, official records on the graves of Nazi leaders have disappeared, not by accident. They were intentionally eliminated after the war. Some Protestant and Catholic churches, responsible for managing cemeteries in different German regions, were notified by Allied military authorities to avoid documentation that might attract the attention of sympathizers or provoke unwanted gatherings. In the 1950s, an increase in visits to suspicious graves was detected in Bavaria. Small groups, always discreetly dressed, came during the early morning or late evening. They carried no banners or sang. They left only symbols, a white carnation, an oak leaf, or a smooth stone engraved with a rune. The state decided to take action. Signs were posted prohibiting the deposit of unauthorized objects. But the visits continued, more discreetly, more difficult to trace. The case of Philipp Buhler was unusual. He directed the Nazi euthanasia program. When the war ended, he committed suicide after being captured. His body was buried in a mass grave. No sign. Years later, investigators found the medical record of his admission. He was identified. But the exact location of his grave remains unknown. The cemetery was urbanized. It became a park. Nothing was left in sight. Dr. Leonardo Conti, another high-ranking medical official of the regime, also took his own life in his cell awaiting trial. His remains were returned to his family. He was buried in Berlin. Over the years, the tombstone was removed. The grave still exists, but it is unmarked. Grass covers it. No one cares for it. Sometimes a dry bouquet appears. No one asks. No one answers. In the Berlin State Archive, there are internal reports on the surveillance of unmarked graves. Some documents mention sporadic visits on key dates, April 20th, January 30th, May 1st. The cameras installed capture individuals who do not look at other graves. They walk straight to the point. They stop. They remain silent. Then they leave, always alone. Never the same face twice. When the mass graves were discovered around Berlin, some remains were analyzed. Teeth belonging to high-ranking officers were detected, but by government decision, the analysis was not continued. They were reburied, unidentified. The priority was to avoid any public association with specific names in the regime. The case of Odilo Globoknik was another of the most uncomfortable. One of those directly responsible for the extermination in the eastern camps, he committed suicide in 1945 after being arrested by British troops. He was buried in secret. But an error in the transcription of the medical report led to the identification of the site years later. There was pressure to remove it, but the authorities decided to cover the space with earth and vegetation. Today it looks like any other green area. Franz Stangl, commander of Sobibor and Treblinka, was arrested in the 1960s and extradited. He died in prison shortly after his confession. His body was returned to his family. It is said that he was buried in Brazil, but there is no confirmed information. No one has located the grave. Some believe he was cremated. Others that he was buried under another name. The Brazilian government has not commented. In Austria, some rural cemeteries hide graves of lower-ranking Nazi officials. Local communities know who is there, but they don't mention it. The inscription is usually a common name, without conspicuous dates. The goal is to erase the connection. Sometimes the gravestones were placed by relatives secretly without informing church authorities. Over time, they became part of the landscape. The Red Cross archive contains cross-references to European cemeteries where Nazi criminals might be buried, but the documents are not public. They are used only for forensic identification. Sometimes the data is shared with governments if there are ongoing investigations. But generally, it is kept confidential. They avoid publishing locations that might generate tributes. At the Dachau cemetery, unmarked urns were found. Some had codes that corresponded to POW numbers, but others did not. It is presumed that they might contain remains of camp officials who died before liberation. The local church asked that they remain sealed. They do not want to open discussions. The agreement was to keep them in safekeeping without intervention. There are also numerous cases of bodies moved secretly. Some relatives, after the war, obtained permission to move remains privately. They did it at night with the help of contacts within the administration. In other cases, silence was paid. Rural cemeteries accepted bodies without question. Today, these graves are indistinguishable from the others. Memorial organizations have denounced that this practice allowed certain criminals to avoid total oblivion. Although there is no official headstone, the body is still there, and those who know visit it. Most governments don't act. They say there is no legal basis for exhuming remains if there is no pending crime. But they continue to record cases. The most recent problem was in 2017. In a cemetery in northern Germany, a group placed a flag with forbidden symbols on an unmarked grave. It was at night. The security camera recorded everything. The next day, the flag was gone, but the video was leaked. The police intervened. They discovered that beneath that grave lay the remains of a Reich Ministry of the Interior official. No one knew. The city council ordered the area to be covered with earth and the inscription removed. The case was closed without public comment. Today, Germany and other countries continue to face the dilemma: what to do with the bodies of those who committed crimes but were not brought to justice? How to deal with graves that can become symbols? The solution until now has been silence: bury without naming, monitor without showing, document without publishing. Thus, the remains of many Nazi leaders remain underground, without a name, without a cross, without an official history, but not forgotten. The cemetery under surveillance, scandals, graffiti, and hidden exhumations. At the beginning of 2011, one winter morning, a Berlin municipal service worker noticed something strange. The side gate of the Invalidenfriedhof was open. There were no signs of forced entry, but someone had entered. Footprints in the damp earth led to an area not shown on tourist maps. The grounds were covered in fog, and the leafless trees revealed the silhouettes of several half-buried gravestones. Upon arriving, the employee saw that one grave had been disturbed. The earth was removed in a block, as if dug with precision. The gravestone had no visible inscription, only a rectangular slab covered in moss. But upon closer inspection, he noticed signs of recent activity: boot prints, discarded surgical gloves, a broken flashlight, and a half-buried black bag. He called the police. When the officers arrived, the entire area was cordoned off. There were no witnesses. The nearby cameras had been out of service for weeks. A preliminary report indicated that the skeletal remains beneath that grave had been partially exposed. They were incomplete. Parts of the skull and limbs were missing. According to inside sources, they belonged to an SS officer buried unnamed after the war. The authorities decided to keep the case hush-hush. There was no press conference, only a classified archive note. But in the following days, independent journalists began investigating. They contacted former cemetery caretakers. One of them, who asked not to be identified, confirmed that the area had been a subject of interest for decades. According to him, in the 1990s, a far-right group had tried to place a commemorative plaque at that very spot. It was removed at dawn. No one was arrested. There are reports of other silent interventions in the Berlin Senate archives. In 2002, a camera captured 3 people walking along the area of the inner wall of the Invalidenfriedhof. They were carrying large backpacks. They were there for 46 minutes, then they left. The next morning, a metal cross was found partially buried between 2 bushes. There was no name, only a symbol, a swastika scratched out in red paint. In 2007, surveillance was stepped up after graffiti was discovered on an uninscribed tombstone. The message read, "Here lies the traitor." The police removed the graffiti in less than 6 hours. The grave in question was located next to the canal. According to old records, it belonged to a colonel who died in 1945 from war wounds. It is unknown whether he directly participated in the regime's crimes, but it wasn't only ideological extremists who were interested in the cemetery. In 2015, a group of urban archaeologists requested permission to scan the subsoil of the Invalidenfriedhof using radar technology. They wanted to detect possible unidentified remains. The request was denied. However, they carried out part of the work from the outside, taking advantage of an area where the perimeter wall had collapsed. They detected at least 4 rectangular cavities at a depth of 1 meter. There are no official records of these graves. On another occasion, in 2010, a military history student photographed several gravestones partially covered by vegetation. Upon enlarging the images, he detected a hand-engraved symbol, a headless eagle with outstretched wings. He reported it to the cultural authorities. Days later, the stone disappeared. The student returned to the site. In its place were disturbed earth and dried leaves. There was no official explanation. Over the years, more than a dozen anonymous interventions at the Invalidenfriedhof have been documented, some with ideological objectives, others for unknown purposes. On certain anniversaries, such as April 20th or January 30th, police surveillance is reinforced. But the visitors arrive days before, or weeks after. They act silently. They leave no direct trace, only minimal signs: a dried flower, a carved stone, an unlit candle. Internal reports from Berlin's security forces include notes of sporadic gatherings around the canal, small groups stopping in front of the wall. They observe, they take photographs, they don't cross the gate, they don't enter the cemetery. But their behavior is recorded. It is suspected that some of these people are part of European networks that exchange coordinates of historical sites linked to the Nazi regime. In 2016, a particular case raised concerns. During a routine patrol, 2 officers found a tombstone with disturbed earth and a half-buried wooden box. Inside were remnants of old documents, not originals. They were copies of Third Reich speeches printed on modern paper. There was also a cassette recording of military music. No one was arrested. The box was destroyed. The incident was not reported to the press. The Invalidenfriedhof has been the subject of numerous reports, but a full investigation into its unmarked graves has never been authorized. The administration cites reasons of security, respect, and prevention. They say any excavation could spark a political conflict. Therefore, the cemetery remains a frozen space of memory. It is cleaned, pruned, and maintained. But it is not dug up. It is not inspected. No new information is published. In 2018, a thermal camera system was installed on the walls of the Invalidenfriedhof. The order came from the local Senate after receiving reports of suspicious activity during the night. The sensors were activated by motion and sent alerts to a surveillance center located less than 500 meters away. During the first 30 days, 5 illegal entries were recorded. None of them led to arrests. The hooded individuals disappeared into the bushes before the police could arrive. One of those cases caught attention. The sensor detected someone standing for exactly 44 minutes in front of an unmarked gravestone. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood still. Then he slowly backed away, turned around and left through the same spot. The next day, at that same spot, a bouquet of artificial flowers in black, white, and red appeared. There was no sign. The recording was not released. Meanwhile, citizen groups have demanded free access to the cemetery without controls or restricted areas. They say the site is a historical space, not a military area. They are requesting that all gravestones, including those without inscriptions, be publicly catalogued. The City Council has denied these requests, citing heritage protection reasons. They argue that some areas are at risk of structural collapse and others require technical restoration, but they provide no details. Aerial photographs of the cemetery taken by drone have been circulated in some alternative German media. These images reveal areas of the grounds not included in public maps. Small rectangles of lighter earth, aligned in a symmetrical pattern, suggest recent or disturbed graves. These areas are not marked with crosses or stones. They appear to be deliberately hidden. The authors of the images have been prosecuted for flying over a protected area without permission. In 2019, an exhibition was organized in Berlin on sensitive sites from Germany's past. The Invalidenfriedhof was mentioned, but without current photographs, only archival maps from the early 20th century. The official explanation was that there were no recent images available of sufficient quality. However, the organizers admitted that they were pressured not to show details of the unmarked graves. They were asked to maintain a strictly military focus, avoiding references to the Nazi regime. In parallel, memorial organizations have proposed marking anonymous graves with a neutral symbol that warns that the site is documented but unidentified. The idea was rejected by cultural authorities, arguing that any sign, no matter how small, could become an object of worship or protest. The official solution remains to maintain invisibility. During 2020, health restrictions reduced visits to the cemetery, but the number of attempted illegal entry increased. Police records show at least 11 incidents between March and November. Most occurred at night, and in half of them the intruders managed to evade patrols. In some cases, symbols were detected carved into the bark of trees near the graves, always the same: a rune, an inverted triangle, a Gothic letter. In December of that same year, an internal report by the local police force indicated that current measures were insufficient. It was proposed to install ground pressure sensors to detect footsteps in hidden areas. It was also recommended to erect an additional vegetation barrier. But none of these measures were implemented due to a lack of funding. The cemetery remains a semi-open space with passive surveillance. Another incident occurred in 2021. An uninscribed tombstone was found surrounded by a makeshift fence made of sticks and rope. Inside there were candles, old photos, and a handkerchief with ambiguous symbols. Someone had created a small altar. The police intervened and removed everything. The earth was removed and covered with leaves. In the following days, there were no complaints, nor were there any arrests. That same year, the Ministry of Culture launched a campaign to raise awareness about the uses of public space in historical contexts. The Invalidenfriedhof was mentioned only once in a footnote. It was stated that the site was subject to specialized technical control. No names or positions were given. The strategy was to avoid disturbing the memory. There is evidence that some independent researchers have managed to enter the cemetery at unauthorized times. They have accurately documented the location of certain unmarked graves. They have cross-referenced data with death records, Wehrmacht reports, and post-war burial lists. Although they have not published their findings in full, fragments have been leaked on closed forums. Authorities monitor these sites but have taken no action. A 2022 report by a foreign university found that unmarked graves in Berlin, including the Invalidenfriedhof, generate a parallel narrative about the Nazi past. Not because of what they say, but because of what they hide. The absence of names, the partial exhumations, the official silences all contribute to a memory constructed in the shadows. The document was sent to the German authorities. There was no response. To this day, maintenance work continues at the Invalidenfriedhof. The grass is cut, the trees are pruned, visible graves are cleaned, but no new areas are dug up, no plaques are placed. No media outlets are allowed to tour the area without supervision. Every photograph is reviewed, every post is read, the silence remains. Control has not changed. Broken memory, other Nazi graves vandalized, hidden, or protected. Aside from the Invalidenfriedhof, there are other German cemeteries where the same pattern is repeated. Graves linked to the Nazi regime remain hidden, deteriorated, or under surveillance. In each case, the institutional response has been different. Some were removed without warning, others remain silent, unmarked, and a few preserved under historical justification. One of the most talked about cases occurred in Wunsiedel, Bavaria. There, Rudolf Hess was buried in 1987 after his death in Spandau prison. The grave began to attract visitors. On specific dates, hundreds of people came to pay their respects. Candles were lit, flowers were placed, some performed the forbidden salute. For years, the situation was monitored by the local police. But in 2011, the owners of the land and Hess's family decided to end the cult. The grave was exhumed, the remains cremated and thrown into the Baltic Sea. The space was left empty. It was covered with gravel. No signs are permitted. In Hamburg, the Ohlsdorf cemetery houses the graves of several Third Reich leaders. Some were vandalized, others remain unmarked. In 1998, graffiti was discovered on Alfred Jodel's grave. Local authorities cleared the site. Shortly afterward, a fence was erected to prevent uncontrolled access. Jodel's name was removed from the tombstone. Only one uninscribed stone remains. no visible information is available. But activists and supporters continue to locate the exact location using old maps. In Stuttgart, the Waldfriedhof Cemetery has graves of former Gestapo officers. Some remain intact. Authorities claim that the names inscribed there do not appear on lists of proven crimes. That is why they have not been removed. However, in 2014, a group of investigators revealed that at least 2 of those officers were linked to deportations. The information was not denied, but no action was taken either. The graves remain in place. They are kept discreet. There is no visible surveillance, but the area is monitored. In Düsseldorf, an unmarked grave in the Northern Cemetery was illegally opened in 2017. A metal box containing papers and medals from the Nazi era was found. No human remains were found. The objects were confiscated. No one claimed ownership. The grave was resealed. Since then, the site has been closed to the public behind a low fence. There is no indication of its contents. The municipal archives are keeping the case confidential. Another case occurred in Kassel. There, the grave of a former camp commander was damaged twice, first with red paint, then with acid. The stone was beyond repair. It was decided to remove it, but a new inscription was not authorized. The ground was leveled and sod was laid. Only a circular mark in the grass betrays that something was removed. There is no plaque, no names, no flowers. In Leipzig, the Southern Cemetery preserves the grave of a propaganda ministry official. In 2008, a cultural organization requested to place an explanatory sign. The goal was to contextualize who he was and what role he played. The proposal was rejected. The tombstone remains unchanged. Every year in November, someone leaves a candle on it. There are never any witnesses. The visitor is never identified. The management of these graves generates tensions between historical memory, legality, and individual freedom. In some cases, relatives of the deceased have claimed that their dead have the right to be remembered without interference. They argue that not all were tried, that some died in combat, that their graves should not be desecrated. The authorities respond that when symbolic use for ideological purposes is detected, they are obliged to act. In many cities, the solution has been to do nothing, to let time erase the traces. Let vegetation cover the tombstones, let rain wear away the names. But in other cases, public pressure has forced decisions, as in Augsburg, where the grave of a close associate of Himmler was dug up and moved without warning. The site was reassigned. There is no trace of the previous burial. In Frankfurt, a military cemetery contains the remains of soldiers identified with the regime. There, the rule is not to place symbols. The gravestones indicate name, rank, and date of death. There are no specific crosses. No decorations are allowed. Visits are permitted but are monitored. On sensitive dates, security is reinforced. Authorities keep records of those who enter these areas. This information is not published. The general policy is to act only when there is public awareness or a risk of sympathizing. If a grave remains forgotten without visitors or symbols, it is likely that no one will intervene. But if someone places a flower, a candle, an insignia, or a phrase linked to the regime, the protocol is activated. In many cases, the response is immediate: cleaning, removal, sanction. In others, they act cautiously. They wait. They evaluate. There is not always consensus. In rural areas, there are cemeteries where the graves of former Nazi Party members remain visible with full names and dates. No one touches them. No one visits them. Neighbors know about them, but they don't comment on them. Only when someone from outside arrives do the alarms go off. The authorities ask that people avoid pointing fingers, not mentioning them, not publishing images. The strategy remains silence. In Bremen, a gravestone dedicated to a former Waffen-SS officer was removed after being graffitied for 3 consecutive years. The local council cited maintenance reasons, but residents knew there was political pressure. The site was covered with earth and is now part of the cemetery's pedestrian path. There are no markings, there are no vestiges. In Dresden, a grave with symbols associated with National Socialism was noticed by a tourist in 2016. He posted the image on social media. The photo went viral. Authorities acted within a week. The gravestone was removed. The surrounding area was cleaned. A new slab was laid without symbols or names. The incident was not officially acknowledged, but since then, inspections have become more frequent throughout the area. In Hanover, the grave of a former camp commander remained undisturbed for decades. But in 2020, a group of students presented research demonstrating his direct role in mass executions. The news reached the press. The cemetery became a site of debate. Soon after, a fence was erected around the area. Then the tombstone was covered over, and finally, the name was erased. The space remains closed. In southern Germany, several small cemeteries hold burials of National Socialist Party members as normal. The families have maintained their burial rights. The tombstones bear no illegal symbols, only names and dates. Authorities say that as long as there is no glorification, there is no reason to intervene. But in some areas, cameras have been placed without notification. Movements are recorded. Visits are noted. In Nuremberg, a grave located in a section far from the main cemetery was damaged in 2015. The stone was broken. Flowers were burned. The perpetrators were not identified. The cemetery administration decided to remove all artifacts from the site and place only a numerical sign. Since then, that number has not appeared in the public registry. The site exists, but is not listed on maps. It is a grave deliberately hidden. In Essen, a gravestone bearing the name of a doctor who worked in concentration camps was removed following an anonymous complaint. The administration reviewed the files and confirmed that the person had been charged, though never tried. The decision was made internally. The family was notified. An offer was made to move the remains to a common grave. The family did not respond. The grave was removed. In some cases, the management of these graves has gone to court. In Bonn, a family filed a lawsuit to prevent the removal of a gravestone that included an inscription referring to sacrifice for the fatherland. The court ruled in favor of the city council, noting that the phrase could be interpreted as glorifying a banned ideology. The stone was removed. The land was left vacant. In Cologne, a citizens' group promoted an initiative to document all graves of people linked to the Nazi regime. They wanted to create a public archive. They sought funding. They proposed collective mapping. The proposal was rejected. The authorities said that such information could be used for unintended purposes. The project was never implemented, but some of its data circulates on private networks. On other occasions, the presence of these graves has generated diplomatic tensions. In Berlin, an embassy protested when a media outlet reported that an official with a Nazi past was buried near a national monument. The report was denied. But it was later confirmed that the burial site did exist. A proposal was made to move the grave. The family refused. Instead, a hedge was installed to block the view. To this day, no agreement remains. There are cemeteries where the management of these graves depends on the level of notoriety. If the name is known, the authorities usually act quickly. If not, they prefer to wait. Some sites have been left to natural erosion. Stones fall. Names are erased. Memory disappears, but in other cases oblivion never comes because someone leaves a flower, a candle, a photo. Then history reappears. Debates have erupted in multiple regions about what to do with these spaces. Some call for their removal, others for them to remain but with context, and some for them to remain untouched. The balance is fragile. Each grave is unique, every name a decision. There is no single rule, no common policy. Meanwhile, surveillance continues, visits are observed, the signs are recorded, the past is still present, even if it is not mentioned, even if it is denied, even if it is hidden. History is not erased with stones, nor with silence, nor with earth. It is hidden, it is transformed, it disperses, but it is still there. And in Germany, beneath layers of grass, cement or gravel, traces remain of an era that never quite disappears. Because every nameless grave, every removed tombstone, every sealed space is a memory that cannot be completely buried.